Back with legendary news anchor Dan Rather. Mr. Rather, what do you uh, think of the Keith Olbermann situation that recently happened over the weekend? He ended his contract early with NBC.
Right.
What do you think has been the impact of Keith Olbermann on journalism and in cable news?
Well, I don't know the details. I don't know anybody who knows the details of Keith Olbermann leaving. But like him or not like him, or be mixed in your opinion or have no opinion, he changed the whole landscape of cable television because he took MSNBC as their primetime anchor in the direction of partisan journalism. That's not a criticism. This was a response to Fox being partisan on the right. Olbermann, I think, rightly saw an opening for partisan journalism on the left, and by doing so, I'd say he changed the landscape and had tremendous impact. He has a long record, Keith does, of having difficulty with people above him, corporate masters, if you will, of networks. And so I'm not surprised. I think it's a loss, but I'm not surprised that he left. And I'd be very interested to know when we finish digging into what, if any, influence Comcast buying NBC had on this decision. Now, Comcast says a version of, we didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
NBC said, listen, that's too far-fetched. But
Well,
one wonders.
You've criticized in the past media conglomerates and these corporate ownerships and how few companies own most of the major news outlets. What do you think will be the effect on NBC News with this merger with Comcast?
Well, the direct and straight and honest answer is, I don't know. But if the past is prologue, it may not be all that good for NBC News and therefore for the news-consuming American public. That I have spoken out before over a number of years about this, that as we sit here tonight, no more than 6, and by my count 4 or 5, large international conglomerate companies control something more than 80% of the true national news coverage of news in this country. That's not a healthy thing for us. I don't know how to reverse it, but I think it should be reversed, and I think someone should be thinking very carefully about it, because as recently as the 1950s, we had some 55 to 57 different media outlets that could be called truly national distribution or very wide regional distribution. Now we have only 6 at most, and as I say, 4 or 5. This is not healthy. It's not healthy for journalism, and therefore it's not healthy for the country. But I have spoken about the corporatization, the politicalization, and the trivialization of news. I think anybody who watches television, listens to radio, reads newspapers with any regularity would, whatever their political persuasion, would agree with that.
When I was growing up watching you, Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw, nightly news has vastly changed since those days.
That it has.
Now you have Diane Sawyer, Katie Couric, and Brian Williams. What do you see nightly news in the future changing to?
Well, you know, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience, but it's hard to be optimistic about the evening newscasts. We're talking about the newscasts that come on at 5:30, 6:30, 7 o'clock, the national newscasts. Their audiences are down dramatically, tremendously. And that's a direct result of what I called before the enlarged competitive pit. It would not surprise me to see one of the so-called big 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, drop their evening news over the next 3 to 5 years. Wouldn't surprise me at all. That it's a bit of a dinosaur of edge of the business, mixed metaphors, but it's a dinosaur in its way that very seldom do I run across anybody who watches the evening news anymore. Their audience has gotten older.
Well, they have more of an audience than Bill O'Reilly does, and he's...
That's true. They have, and the cumulative audience for them, that is, if you take all 3, the newscast in the Eastern Time Zone is on at 6:30, their cumulative audience is probably still, I would guess, 18 million sets in use. That would be more than 18 million people watching. When I began the CBS Evening News as anchor and managing editor, succeeding Walter Cronkite in 1981, I think that figure was about 27, 28, maybe as many as 30 million. So it's shrinking. But it is a little unfair to the evening newscasts, and you mentioned the 3 main anchors, all 3 of them very good professionals, that it's a little unfair in this sense that people, if a Bill O'Reilly or for that matter a Keith Olbermann gets what for cable is a large
1.1 million.
Yes. If, let's say, Bill O'Reilly would get, what, 2 to maybe 3 million sets in use at night, don't hold me to the figure, maybe more or less, and Keith Olbermann gets 1 million, then everybody pays attention to that. Whereas the big 3 newscasts, which are getting far larger audiences, even the least of them would get at least double that. It's a little unfair. But listen, life is unfair and not all of journalism is fair.
True. How do you think journalists and the media in general have covered the Obama administration thus far?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of coverage, hasn't it? It depends on where you're watching, where you're reading, where you're listening. I think overall in the main, the coverage has been pretty good. I think it has been fair. That he went through a period when he first came into his presidency, I would say 6 to 8 months into the presidency, where he seemed to be out of touch with much of what was happening in the country. This is par for the course for any president in the White House. It is a bit of a bubble, and particularly for first-term presidents. But I think the coverage overall has been pretty fair.
Right, and on that note, we're going to take another commercial break. We'll be right back with legendary newsman Dan Rather.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We're joined by former CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather. Mr. Rather, what do you see as the future of journalism for us journalism students here at American University?
Well, the most important question is the future of journalism for the country, because a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely when necessary press is the red beating heart of democracy. And journalism right now is in crisis. Nobody can quite see the future. The old model, the model that allowed bureaus to be overseas, have large staffs, that model, that business model is gone. No new model has really taken its place. So journalism is in what the Catholic Church calls an interregnum. The old order is gone, the new order is not yet in place. Somebody will figure out a way, I'm very hopeful, to do the kind of investigative journalism which I like to do and which I think is so important, and to do meaningful international coverage, which, as you know, has shrunk tremendously over the years. For journalism students, I just smile and say, if you burn with a hot, hard flame to do it, if you have a passion to do it, if you love to do it, if this is what you want your life to be about, then despite all the troubles and American journalism being in crisis at the moment, you'll find a way as a student. But the students always preach the gospel of learn to write. If you learn to write and learn to write well, that's the bedrock of the craft. You may not be wealthy or famous or well known, but you'll always be able to make a living at it. And
you talked about investigative reporting. You do plenty of that on your HDNet show, Dan Rather Reports. Can you just talk about that? I recently read that your crew has been in Alaska because they're working on a profile on the senator who won in.
We have.
The write-in candidate. Well,
this is an hour-long program which premieres each week on Tuesday nights and then is repeated during the week on HDNet, which is owned by Mark Cuban out of Dallas. It's also available on iTunes. Our DNA is investigative reporting. We also have a strong inclination to do overseas reporting. I'm just back from a trip to the Middle East, and we like to cover politics. That's where our focus is. We don't do reporting about celebrities. We very seldom do interviews with book authors and that sort of thing. Our hardcore is investigative journalism, and I'm very proud of what we do, and I've never had a better time in my life in my whole career.
You ended your last show on CBS Evening News in 2005 with the tagline, Courage.
I did.
How can future journalists, be courageous, in your opinion?
Well, not easily, particularly these days, because the pressure's on to go along, get along, and to move with the herd. And the pressure's always been there, but never as great as it is now. I've never really had courage, but I like the word. It was my father's favorite word. And I did sign off the last newscast I did for CBS News with it, partly in memory of my father, but also, our country's going through a very difficult time. People are having a difficult time. I've always thought it's worth reminding people, just to say, any of us can have courage at every moment of every day. But if we aspire to have it, then we'll either get it or something very close to it.
And on that note, I thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for this ATV special broadcast. Make sure to check us online at auatv.com. Thank you for watching.